Tonight we are very privileged to have Dr. Steve Emslie. He's coming to us from North Carolina, where he's a professor, and at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. For the last 25 years, he's been going to Antarctica once a year, and he's been studying the penguins. The 5 species breed in Antarctica, but only 2 are endemic. The Adélie, which is the one you're seeing there, I think, and the Emperor, the one that the March of the Penguins was made about, that everybody fell in love with. And Dr. Emslie studies the ecology and the breeding biology of this penguin. And it's the most abundant species in Antarctica. And it also serves as an excellent indicator species. You know, birds in general are good indicator species. And he's looking at the marine environment there. But there's another connection. When I put this in for approval for the master naturalist here, they say, well, what's a penguin got to do with Texas? It's got everything to do with Texas because of climate change. And what happens in Antarctica is going to affect the whole world, not just the little dressed up penguins that live there, but all of us. And so this is what he's doing is he's developed a lot. He's going to tell you all about this. I'm not going to steal it, but he's looked at the ecology and the diet of these penguins, past and present. Now, what does past mean? When you die and you're a penguin on Antarctica, you do not decompose because it's too cold and dry there. So he can look at penguins that have been dead a long time and find out what's happening, their tissues, looking at their tissues and so forth, to find out how they're adapting to the changing climate. And this is what makes them so important to us here in Texas to figure out these kinds of things. So you probably, if you were here before, Dr. Emslie talked to us about the California condor and his work crawling into caves and finding these things that are thousands of years old. Well, he's going to tell us tonight about the penguins, and we welcome you, Dr. Emslie. So without further ado, here he is.
Thank you very much, Patsy. Thank you, Patsy, for that introduction. And everybody can hear me okay?
Yeah. Can you hear him okay?
Okay, good. First of all, I'm really impressed with all the activities you have with your group there. It's really nice. You have all those bird outings and so forth. So that's really great. So what I'll do here is just mention that I do have this website on my penguin research that you could copy down or take a quick photo of that if you wanted to look at some of the papers I've published and some of the blogs and so forth that we have put together on over the years with this project. And what I want to do is sure this works. There we go. As Patsy said, there's 2 endemic species of penguins in the Antarctic, the Emperor and the Adélie. And this map shows where Emperor colonies are located all around the continent, and so are Adélie colonies located in those areas and more. And the Emperor, though, breeds on ice, on sea ice. And so it doesn't leave a record behind like the Adélie penguin does. And so there's a lot more information that we can gain from looking at the past record of the Adélie penguin with climate change. And so before I go on to the Adélie penguin, I'm going to need some water here for a second. Before I go on with the Adélie, I did want to mention a couple of things about the Emperor penguin. They walk over 100 kilometers in some cases across the sea ice. I hope you can see my cursor here. But they in winter will walk across this sea ice that forms around Antarctica every winter to get close to the continent on fast ice or ice that's connected to the continent, because as their breeding cycle takes so much time starting in winter, their chicks don't fledge until later that summer, about 6 months or more later. And so they want that ice to be breaking up and going back to this place back here along the continent where they will have this stable platform until their chicks are ready to fledge and go to sea for the first time. And then the sea is close to them and they can get into the water and get plenty of food and survive their first winter. So that's why they march across so much sea ice to get to their colonies. And I did want to mention that part of the problem today, and this is the Antarctic Peninsula, which I go back to this map, we're talking about this area right up here, which juts out farther to the north than any other section of the Antarctic. And a recent study just published by Fretwell et al. In 2023, they looked at some emperor penguin colonies, 6 of them that are located where their labels are here along this part, where sea ice has been declining in the last couple of years, more so than ever before. And it's declining so fast that 5 of these colonies failed because that ice broke up too soon before they finished raising their chicks. And the chicks were still downy and couldn't survive into the cold water. So that's unfortunate, and that's what's happening to the emperor penguins. One colony over here survived, this one because it was more sheltered, and the winds and the breakup didn't affect that one, but the others were all lost. And the emperor penguin is becoming endangered in the Antarctic. There's about 500,000 of them left at a number of different colonies. And so they're of concern now with the climate change that's occurring. And Antarctica is a global indicator, as Patsy said, for climate change everywhere, including in Texas. So it's relevant to anywhere we go. So I don't have time to talk more about emperor penguins, but I just wanted to update you on that since they are the other endemic species in the Antarctic. And my current grant is using multiple stable isotopes to study foraging ecology of penguins, Adélie penguins, over the last 10,000 years in the Antarctic. And I'm not going to talk tonight about isotopes and get into all the science of that. Instead, I'm going to go through more on the Adélie penguin itself, its background, why it's a good indicator species, its paleohistory that unraveled in the Ross Sea over the past 10,000 years of their record there, and then new directions with the current funding I have and the tourship support that goes along with that, which is really important. And finally, the future of conservation, what this project means for Adélie penguins in the future. So I'll have a couple of stories to tell you, especially about the paleohistory here. And first, I want to go through briefly the Adélie penguin's breeding biology, because that's why it's a good indicator species to understand this, this breeding cycle. And like most seabirds, they mate for life and they come back to the same nest site every year. And the male will come back first and he'll rebuild a pebble nest. And they have to build a nest of pebbles because there's no vegetation to build nests there. And so they can build a nice pebble nest. The mate will come back to the same place as well. That's how they find each other, because they don't spend the winter together. And they will then build a nest, mate, and lay 2 eggs. And you can see a nice pebble nest here. And these pebbles, as they rebuild these nests every year, these pebbles build up into layers and layers. And like an archaeological site, these layers record the history of these penguins over time. And I'll show you that here in a second. But the male takes first incubation shift, as a female spends a lot of energy producing those 2 eggs. So she goes to sea for a couple of weeks while the male fasts and incubates and protects the eggs. And the chicks hatch, and the female comes back after 2 weeks. So they trade off incubation until the chick hatches at about 35 days of incubation. And then the chicks need brooding for 2 weeks or so before they can stand on their own next to the nest. They're fed a rich diet of krill and some fish and squid. And the adults will feed them by direct regurgitation into the chick's mouth, so they don't lose the food to skuas or other flying birds that might be around that would steal the food off the ground if they regurgitated it there. And the chicks grow really well. This chick has 2 good parents that have obviously raised chicks together before and know how to take care of that chick. It's well fed with krill in its stomach and in its gullet there. And it's all downy still. So this chick's probably about 3 weeks old. And they will continue to feed it. And then both parents will go out to sea when the chicks finally go into a creche. Now, if the parents are really good, the chick will be very well fed. And this is really a good indicator of good parents. That chick can hardly move, it's so well fed. But they have to have a high weight when they finally fledge so that they can survive their first winter at sea. Very important. If they survive that first winter, they'll probably live a long time. After the chicks have shed their down and grown true feathers, they come down to the beach, and now they can go into the water with these feathers, which form a layer around them like a wetsuit. So it protects them and insulates them as they dive and forage at sea. Now, no adults are with them in this crash as they are down at the beach, and they will flap their wings a lot to build their muscles up, and they will be looking out to sea, probably getting hungry, not being fed as much now by their parents. And eventually one of them will say, okay, I'm going to go, like this one right here. And so the rest of them say, okay, here we go. And they all go out to sea. And at first they try to swim on the surface, but they're really heavy bodied and sink and panic. But eventually they figure out that, oh, they can move a lot easier underwater and use their wings as propulsion units. And then they're happy. So they disappear, and it'll be at least 2 years before any survivors of this group come back to either the same colony where they were hatched or a nearby colony and learn how to start breeding. So their survivorship over 2 years is mainly out on the sea ice in winter, on the ice edge, and then eventually back to the colonies. What is interesting in these data here is I worked with Wayne and Sue Travelpiece when I first went to the Antarctic in the early 90s. And we were measuring the fledgling weight of these chicks before they left the colony, right at that point they were about to go. We were banding them to look at survival returns in the future, and also weighing them to look at fledgling weights. And this is fledgling weights, mean weights in grams from late 80s through into the 90s here. And you can see how much it varies from year to year. And this variation is important because it relates to survivorship. And the heavier they are, if they're way up here in weight and up here, they will have high survivorship in that group, that cohort that leaves in that year. But if their weights are way down here, then they probably won't survive. Many of them won't survive. And so they won't be recruiting back to the colony. And these weights are dependent on the krill that they eat and how much the parents feed them during the breeding season. And the krill varies every year too in the Antarctic based on the amount of sea ice. So there's a tight link between the amount of sea ice, the amount of krill that's produced each year, and the survivorship of these penguins. It all relates together. And so if you have a colony like this, these are Adélie colony here, and it's a small colony, and you can see the pebbles there that they've collected, and now they're later in the breeding season. If there's plenty of food available out here for these chicks to have high weights, then this colony will grow in the future as those chicks return and set up their own nests. But if there's less food out here and those chicks are leaving at a lower weight, and each year is like that, then no chicks are returning. And as the adults die, the colony shrinks and finally disappears and becomes an abandoned colony. And you get a scattering of pebbles in these abandoned colonies that stand out on the terrain, because you can see it's all sorted pebbles about the same size that penguins once used in nests. And then the surrounding terrain is boulders and other rocks, and so very different outlook. And you can see way back here in the background some other pebble areas. So there's a whole bunch of abandoned penguin colonies in this area. And so whatever this colony might date to will tell you when they were there in the past and when they had all the conditions they needed for successful breeding. So that's a good indicator species for the marine environment. And here's what they need. They need, for a colony like this one down here, you can see the pink on the mounds down there from guano, the krill in their guano. They need that ice-free terrain to breed. They need this open water access to get in and out of their colony. And they need that krill and that food to be near enough so that they can go out, forage, come back, and feed those chicks so they do leave at a heavy weight and survive. And in that way, the colony will grow. Now down here on the beach, there's some darker mounds. These are old abandoned mounds. And if I was to go into those mounds and excavate them and recover some bones and other tissues of these penguins and radiocarbon date them, whatever date they come out to be, let's say 1,000 years old, then we know that these marine conditions existed at that time in the past as well. So these bones and remains then give us an indication of past marine environments that we can track through time and where these sites are located. So it's a really nice way to look at these remains and apply them to marine conditions and what has happened in the past with climate change. And as the pebbles build up, they form what's called ornithogenic or bird-formed soils. And these are the soils that contain all these remains. It's mainly the pebbles of the same size that comprise these soils, but also remains of chicks that died at the colony, bones and feathers, also remains of eggshell, hatched eggs that's in here, preserved in here, and prey remains in the guano, including small squid beaks, fish bones, fish otoliths. All these things will be preserved in this soil because of the dry and cold conditions in the Antarctic. And so this is a fresh ornithogenic soil in a colony that's about 500 years old, and there's drier soil down here and moister soil up here. And it's really dark when you have a young ornithogenic soil because it's full of organics. And it also smells really bad, by the way. So when I excavated this out of an active colony and then stepped out of the pit to take a picture, all these Adélie penguins jumped in because they were really curious what I was doing and saw all these fresh pebbles exposed. So they were taking a close look at it. So that was, they're pretty funny in their behavior. But that's how these ornithogenic soils form and build up over time. And here's an older soil now that's dried out more, and it's taken on a pinkish hue from the krill in their guano. And you can see there's all pebbles in there and the sediments. And then at the bottom here, there's a break where you get into either a gravel terrace or beach sediments, glacial sediments, very different kind of structure. They don't have all the pebbles, it's more gravel. And so that's the interface where the penguins first set up a colony here at the bottom of this ornithogenic soil. And so I can find tissues at that interface and get a radiocarbon date, and I'll know when this colony first formed at this site. I can get radiocarbon dates on organic remains all the way up to the surface and know how long the colony was occupied before it was abandoned. So I can get all that information from one of these excavations. It's kind of like an archaeologist would do the same thing, looking at levels through time and piecing things together. And so we excavate these sites like an archaeologist, and we set up a test pit and we go down 5-centimeter levels and screen and sort all the sediments from each level to obtain all the organic remains, including the tiny fish bones and otoliths. So we use fine screens to do this. And here are the screens that we use, a horse screen at the top that's stacked with 2 other screens below. And this gets the pebbles and larger bones and things out. We can sort that in the field to get the organic remains. The middle screen is more of a window screen size. And so that we would put into a bag and save and sort in the lab later. And then the bottom screen is really fine screen, which catches all those tiny otoliths. So that, of course, is also taken back to the lab for sorting later. And so all of this organic remains, here's a screen full of bones. And most of the bones are going to be those of chicks that died. So they're undeveloped bones, really porous. And then there's some squid beaks in here, eggshell, and all of this is a biological archive on historical information that the penguins have left for us. Not only their own remains, but they sampled the marine environment for us too. And so there's fish and squid remains, and you can look at diets by identifying those remains as well. So it gives you a lot of good information just from these sediments. And sometimes you get such good preservation, you find whole chick mummies. This mummy is hundreds of years old from the Ross Sea in the Antarctic. And it's got the feathers, the skin on the feet, toenails, the bill, everything, skin, all that is there. So a number of different analyses can be done with this as well, including ancient DNA and other studies. So those are fairly common in the Ross Sea area where it's really cold and dry. So this is the archive: penguin bones and feathers, mummies, eggshells, egg membrane tissue even in there, and fish bones, otoliths, and squid beaks. And the kinds of studies that can be done are listed here. Radiocarbon dating to get that occupation history I mentioned before. Ancient DNA provides information on evolutionary rates in penguins. Stable isotope analyses, which tells us about their diet and shifts in their diet through time. And now, most recently, I've had some scientists in Germany interested in the mummies because they are looking for ancient RNA viruses. And we've actually found some of these viruses in some of the mummies. So they're pretty excited about that because they rarely preserve. But the preservation in Antarctica has been good enough to have them preserved for hundreds or thousands of years in these mummies there. So let's go on to the paleohistory of Adélie penguins in the Ross Sea. And I can tell you a little bit of stories about this. So the Ross Sea, when you look at the Antarctic continent, is down here. It's a huge area, and about a third of all Adélie penguins breed in that Ross Sea region. And this rectangle shows a blow up over here on the right, where all the active Adélie penguin colonies are located today. And you can see Ross Island down here is right abutted to the Ross ice shelf, which is a huge ice shelf that expands and contracts over time with climate change. And it's interesting because one of the largest Adélie penguin colonies in the Ross Sea is located right there at that edge, at the ice edge to the Ross ice shelf. That's at Cape Crozier. And then another large colony is located way out here at the opposite end at Cape Adare. That's also a huge colony. I'll talk about that one more here in a minute. And then there's several other colonies in between. And you'll notice this says Terra Nova Bay Polynya. Polynya is an area of open water surrounded by sea ice that's particularly obvious in the winter. You'll see ice all around here, but then open water right there, driven by katabatic winds coming off the continent. And there's a Polynya here, a Polynya down here, and a Polynya up over here as well. And these Polynyas are foraging areas for the penguins. And in fact, Adélie penguins are most often associated with some Polynya or another around Antarctica. Probably 2/3 of all the colonies are associated with Polynyas. So they're very important productive areas for feeding for these penguins. And I'll get back to those in a second. So that's the situation in the Ross Sea today, but all these colonies there, and I've been able to survey and sample colonies on Ross Island, ancient colonies along the Scott coast where there are no penguins today, in here in Terra Nova Bay, and also way up here at Cape Hallet and Cape Adare. So I've been fortunate to be able to go to all these places and do some sampling over the 25, 30 years I've been working in the Antarctic. And I've been working in the Ross Sea actually the last 25 years. So this has really been productive information on the history of penguins in this area and how climate change has influenced their distribution. So here's the Ross ice shelf, and it's a huge floating ice shelf. It's an accumulation of glaciers that come off the continent and merge in the sea and then float out into the sea. And so they're floating ice shelves. They're grounded in some areas, but they're about 30 meters above the water here, and then 2 or 3 times that below the water. So it's a huge amount of ice. And over time, this ice moves forward and backward through the Ross Sea. And in the last ice age, it moved all the way to the end of the Ross Sea and closed off the entire place to breeding penguins, and then slowly melted back after that. And this diagram shows that movement. We know this from the geologic record, from looking at grounding lines on the marine basin here. But the Ross ice shelf moved all the way out to here during the last glacial maximum, which was at about 18 to 20,000 years ago. And then when the warming trend happened after the ice age ended, it started to melt back here. By 7,000 years ago, it's back here, which opened up the Terra Nova Bay area. And then by today, it's back here. So that's one of many movements this ice shelf has gone under in the last, this time in the last 20 to 27,000 years. So penguins then were able to move into this area as that ice shelf retreated. And they were here before it came forward before the last ice age. And I do have evidence of that. Don't have time to talk about that today, but they were in the Ross Sea prior to the movement of this ice shelf forward over 27,000 years ago. And then they came back in as it retreated 13,000 years ago. And so this map shows where some of the oldest colonies in the last 10,000 years are located. Right there, Terra Nova Bay, those dots indicate where abandoned colonies, indicate a occupation history going back 7,000 to 8,000 years. And that matches the retreat of that ice shelf and the opening of this Polynya as katabatic winds then came and hit that water when it opened up. And then progressively younger sites go back here to the Scott coast that match the ice shelf continuing to retreat by modern times. So that data fits well with the retreat of the ice shelf back 7,000 to 4,000 years ago. And then at 4,000 years ago, between 4 and 2,000 years ago, this Scott coast is heavily occupied, and Italian geologists called this a penguin optimum. They were getting radiocarbon dates on these colonies to look at glacial movements. And I've sampled them to look at the biology and ecology of these penguins. And this area was heavily occupied because it was open water now, and they could get into the beaches there and set up colonies. They also first occupied Ross Island over here and Franklin Island here, and they've remained in the Terra Nova Bay area continuously for the last 8,000 years. Don't see anything up here yet, so we don't have any evidence there yet. Doesn't say it was not there, but we don't have any occupation record there for this time period. But after this Optimum ended, which was a fairly warm period at the time, it got cooler, and this coastline here got sealed off by ice, so the penguins could no longer get to those colonies. So in this next graph, you'll see that this whole coastline is abandoned now at 2,000 to 1,100 years ago, and remains abandoned today. So they still have not come back in there. But I think they will in the future. As the warming trend continues, penguins will move back into this area as they lose spaces up in this area. You'll see Terra Nova Bay is still occupied, and then Cape Adare is occupied for the first time 2,000 years ago. And I'll show you why that was, because even though that's one of the largest colonies of Adélie penguins today, it's a relatively young colony. And so that's where that occupation record now extends for the last 8,000 years. This is Cape Adare, and it's a large triangular beach, low to sea level. You can see the water in between these ridges here. And all these ridges and all that pinkish color you see there are penguins. And penguins also coming up this slope, which goes 300 meters up to a ridge up here and a terrace, and they nest right on the edge of that terrace as well. This is one of the largest colonies, as I mentioned, and it's these ridges down here are totally manufactured by penguins and using pebbles to build up their nests. When you go down on those ridges, it looks like this, and there's so many penguins here. There's about 338,000 nests have been estimated to be at this colony, and this beach is completely filled with Adélie penguins. And then as you go down farther on one of these ridges, you can see they are penguin formed. They're all pebbles that have been built up over 2,000 years, the age of this site. And they're right close to the continental shelf break. So there's plenty of food in this area. So the penguins like to breed there. They get plenty of food for their chicks. And so that colony keeps growing and growing even today. They're doing quite well there. And here's a cross section of one of those mounds. You can see that it's all pebbles, pinkish color, going down for over a meter. And then you get this volcanic black sand and gravel at the base. So again, that's the interface for when this site was first occupied. And radiocarbon dates are about 2,000 years old on bones that came out of that layer right there at the beginning. So we know this site is only about 2,000 years old, probably because that low beach could not be occupied in the warming period before due to sea level being too high and storm surges being too high to occupy that area. When you look across the beach today and up this 300-meter high terrace, there's they nest all the way up there. So it's amazing to me that these little guys can walk across this beach, then climb another 300 meters, and then make a nest and go there back and forth to feed their chicks and be successful. But they are, and they're doing it all along this slope here too. Now, what I found too on top of this terrace up here is that there's a large flat area, and it looks like this. There's that place where the nests are today. And this large flat area has a lot of abandoned penguin mounds. And those mounds date back to 1,200 years or so, indicating this colony had once been maybe twice as large as it is today. And for some reason, it collapsed back down to the size it is today, but it's growing again now. So it might reoccupy, this species might reoccupy this upper terrace in the future, especially with sea level rise. And as sea level rises down here, these penguins are going to have to abandon nests, especially around the shoreline where storm surges will be worse. And then eventually in the middle, as it gets swamped over too much with water. So I think all these penguins will ultimately retreat back up to this upper terrace. And so they will have a place to move to. That's not true with all colonies. Some colonies will be lost and they'll have to go somewhere else. And another story I wanted to tell you here is right here at this place called Cape Irizar. Now, this is the Terra Nova Bay Polynya again, right here, where we have that continuous record of occupation. This is called an ice tongue here. This is Drygalski ice tongue. It's a glacier that moves rapidly out to sea, and it's longer than wide. And that ice tongue forms the the southern boundary of the Terra Nova Bay polynya that's right in this area. Here's that Scott coast that was heavily occupied during the penguin optimum. And this site right here, I'd never been to until 2016. And I read a paper that said that guano was dated there at about 3,800 to 4,800 years before present. And that made me curious to know if there might be bones and pebble mounds there too that could be excavated. So we went there in 2016 to check it out. And it turned out to be a really interesting place to go. This is what it looks like looking north. There's the Drygalski ice tongue. And you see it's a barren cape. It's actually part of an island that's exposed here. Windswept, snow-covered, ice cliffs around the margins. No penguins could get up there today. So there must have been a way for them to do that in the past, to have that guano dated at over 4,000 years old. We landed on the top there, and it was mainly just boulders and granites. And in 1907, this site was visited by one of Robert Falcon Scott's geology group, and they recorded the granites there. And they always record penguin colonies when they see them, and they did not see a colony there. They did not record one. So we know there was no penguin colony there in the last 120 years or so. So it was definitely not being used when they were there. Well, we didn't find anything on the top here, so we walked down towards the coastline, and there, all of a sudden, I started to find fresh penguin bones. And this is a whole carcass of a penguin chick that died, and its feathers are still there. There's a bit of algae on them, and the bones are there. And it looks like it had just died that season. And so this was really strange to me when I saw this, because I knew that penguins didn't have a colony there today or in the recent past. So how could there be fresh bones there from obvious nesting attempts? And as I walked around further, I found mummies. Here's a chick mummy that was on the surface, which is common to find at active penguin colonies as well. They dry out pretty fast after a year or two. And then we did find the old pebble mounds that were dry and dusty, and excavated into those. And sure enough, there are old bones that fit what I expected to find there, something 4,000 years old or so, when the Scott coast was occupied. So that made sense. And I collected a number of these bones on the surface and subsurface, and ignore this graph right here, the carbon for now. And this is the timeline for radiocarbon dates going back 5,000 years. And these dashed lines show the bracket for the penguin optimum between 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. And bones that we excavated from these mounds were quite old, going back over 5,000 years, in fact, before the penguin optimum, and up to about 800 years old. Bones from the surface that looked fresh, though, were also very old. Some went back to 3,000 years, and some back to around 2,000, and the last ones dated to about 800 years old. So here we had an occupation that started at this site back here, and then there was a break that matches the dates both from the surface bones and subsurface, and then occupation again, and then another break. So it looks like this site was occupied and abandoned several times over millennia. And it was really interesting that we would see this pattern here, because the Scott coast was abandoned 2,000 years ago by all those other colonies, but this one still has occupation there after 2000. So it's very different from those other colonies on the Scott coast. Well, why did the bones appear fresh? I looked at satellite imagery of Cape Irizar, and it's on this island here. And so every decade I looked at from the 1980s to 90s, 2004, 2014, and it showed a gradual melting occurring. And this matches the climate record in the Ross Sea, where the temperatures have risen 0.5 degrees C per decade since the 80s. And so what I think has happened here is that there was a penguin occupation on this island, and it was there because there was open water at that time that changed so that they occupied it or abandoned it, depending on that open water. And the last time it was occupied 800 years ago, that island became covered over with ice and snow and frozen in time. And it was only in recent decades that these bones have melted out, fresh carcasses at the time that were frozen, melted out, and then decayed, and looked like a modern colony that was recently abandoned, but actually it's just an old colony. So that story seems to fit in that, like we see with archaeological remains coming out of glaciers in Canada or in other places in the world, preserved under the ice. Now we have this happening in the Antarctic with bones of penguin chicks coming out from under melting snow. And I hope to get back to this site finally to sample it some more under this current grant and even this season if it works out. So I will have more to this story hopefully in the future. And now looking at what we're doing next, we're doing more sampling with active and abandoned colonies, get isotopes. We're going to sample prey remains and marine phytoplankton. So these polynyas could have a stable isotope signature that we want to track as well through space and time, and use different kinds of isotope analyses to assess these shifts in the baseline of phytoplankton that would affect then the stable isotope signatures of the penguins. So that's all I'll say about the stable isotopes, but it will be what we'll be concentrating on with all these sites over the next couple of years. And partnering with tour ships is going to be important here because we want to collect phytoplankton, algae, marine algae at sea across the Ross Sea. And what better place to do this from as a tour ship that goes back and forth across the Ross Sea. And so Heritage Expeditions out of New Zealand, they're very supportive of researchers on board. And I contacted them a couple of years ago, and they welcomed me on board to sample at land sites as well as marine sites from their ship for 2 cruises that they do in the Ross Sea each year, one in January and one in February. And that's all they can do in the Ross Sea because it clogs up with sea ice before that and after. So it's one of the few ships that actually goes into the Ross Sea, into the deep Antarctic. Most tour ships go into the Antarctic Peninsula. And that's, if anybody in your group there has been to the Antarctic, they've probably gone to the Antarctic Peninsula on one of those trips. But the Ross Sea is much more difficult to get to, and these trips are 28 days long each. And so they go in January, February, about 140 passengers. And I'll go along as a researcher to lecture and to then go ashore and collect remains of penguins, excavate sites, and I even include passengers in some of the research. So it's a win-win situation for both the tour ship company and the passengers, and for me to be able to sample in places that the U.S. Antarctic program could not get me to because they don't have logistical means to do that. So it's really great how this works out. And this is one of my grad students who came along on the 2023 trip, and we're collecting water samples from the bridge of the ship. And so this works out great. They gave us some help with this to set up the sampling. All we do is throw that canister overboard, collect the water, fill that bucket that's down below there, bring it onto the bridge, and then we pump the water through these glass filters that capture all the marine phytoplankton, and then we can use that filter directly for the stable isotope analysis. And so this is what the filters looks like after it has the diatoms and marine algae captured on it. And so we can analyze that directly off of that filter. So it really is an easy procedure, and we're getting some really nice data from this. And in fact, the first year we did this in 2023, we were able to sample all these sites down from the north to the south in the Ross Sea across some of those polynyas. And then in 2024, this last January and February, we were able to get 70 samples over 2 cruises. So we're getting a really nice coverage and baseline of data on the marine ecosystem, as well as sampling more sites, abandoned penguin colonies on the coastline. So we're getting a lot of good data working with this tour company, and I will go back to that with them for a 3rd year this January and February to collect more samples and add to this database. And what this means for the future, well, we know things are changing in the Ross Sea. There's been a marine protected area formed in the Ross Sea, but it's for where penguins are today, not where they'll be in the future. And what I'm hoping our data will show and help us predict is where penguins will go in the future, and we can then add more protections to those areas. Cape Adare will always be important, and that upper terrace will be occupied, but I think they'll start coming back down to this Scott Coast here, and there'll be more dependence on the ecosystems down in that area, and most of these protections are not in that area. So these data can then be apply to conservation efforts and hopefully help us keep the Adélie penguin as an important breeding bird and marine indicator for millennia to come with the climate change that's occurring. And so that's the future of Adélie penguins. And I'll stop there for questions.
Wow, what a story. If you have questions, we would like for you to speak them into this microphone so people on the Zoom can hear the questions and then they can hear him with the answer. Anybody in the room have a question that's burning in your mind right now? Gives you a new appreciation for these birds, doesn't it? Any questions? Let me see if anybody online has them. Look at that face. Let's see. I'm looking here. Becca, any questions online?
No.
Okay. Sorry. Becca, do you have a question?
No.
Okay. Hang on. We got one here. Just a minute.
Given how isolated Antarctica is, how did the penguins get there in the first place? And how far back have they gone? You said 20,000 years? So I guess that
Yes,
would be when
actually,
they migrated there.
yeah. Of all the species of penguins, there's about 17 or 18 species of penguins today. And they evolved in the southern hemisphere. So they've always been in that area. And the oldest penguin fossils are from New Zealand, about 62 million years old. And they were already kind of the same body shape and adaptations of modern penguins at that time. And so they started in the southern hemisphere, and there's penguins from the Antarctic Peninsula, fossils that date to about 50 million years old. And then the rest of the record is kind of spotty after that, but they've always been well adapted to the cold waters, the rich, productive waters of the Southern Ocean. And so the penguins that developed and evolved with the movement of Antarctica into its present position as continental drift occurred, they evolved with it. And that's when we got the two endemic species becoming the most abundant there and truly adapted to the ice conditions that are in that area.
They have a long history.
Yes.
We did have a question
We
here.
have
And go ahead, Becca.
Okay, we have one in the chat. Do you expect most penguin populations will eventually go extinct if warming continues?
Well, that's a good question. There are some species that are doing okay with the warming. And you may have heard the labels climate change winners and climate change losers. And so the losers are the ones that are declining with the warming trend as food changes. And that would be a chinstrap penguin and rockhopper penguin and some of the others that are only distributed in small areas. But others like the Gentoo penguin are actually expanding more in the Antarctic, down the Antarctic Peninsula, because they prefer open water and they are finding more and more habitat suitable for them to breed and expand. So they're a climate change winner. The Adélie penguin is kind of interesting because it's a climate change loser in the Antarctic Peninsula where the sea ice is disappearing and they depend on that sea ice habitat. But in the Ross Sea and East Antarctica, they're doing fine. So they're so far a winner there. So it's one species that has populations that are losers and some that are winners. So in the future, it's hard to say. All species eventually go extinct over maybe a couple of million years. And that just is a factor of changes in the Earth's climate over time, natural cycles and so forth. So in our lifetimes, we'll see penguins continue to decline, some will continue to increase. And the emperor penguin I'm worried about the most as disappearing because it's so well adapted to that ice, but it's losing that habitat. So unless they learn how to start breeding on land, and there are a couple of colonies that they've formed on land, but they're rare. If they started breeding on land, they'd be safer from the breakup of the sea ice that destroys their colonies. That might happen. It's hard to say, but we'll just have to watch and see.
Well, the Adélies look like they're adaptive in that they've moved, as you saw, from the different when the ice was out there, they were here, and then that retreated, they moved up. So and that also speaks to the conservation of protecting those areas where they're likely to go, as you mentioned.
Yes, that's right. And emperor penguins also have adapted and moved to different ice shelves and sea ice areas after they lose a colony. So they do have that ability to move to a new place and try again the following year and be successful. So they are adaptable, and they hopefully can adapt with what's happening now. And yeah, for Adélie penguins, we just need to make sure they have their breeding sites protected as well as their feeding grounds in the marine environment.
So why did you pick the Adélie, Steve, if you're saying the emperor is just as threatened or more threatened?
Well, the Adélie is the only one that has a long record in the Antarctic. The emperor leaves no record being on sea ice. So unfortunately, we don't know much about its past. But the other penguins that breed in the Antarctic, the Gen 2 and Chinstrap, they don't nest in areas where they get long-term preservation either. They form ornithogenic soils, but they're not as old, maybe as old as 2,000 years, I found. But the Adélie penguin, because it breeds in so many places around Antarctica and really cold, dry places too, it's got a record that goes back actually beyond radiocarbon dating. So we have the oldest record of Adélies. And because they are such good marine indicators for the Antarctic, so well adapted to the ice conditions and endemic to that region, they form the best species to look at for long-term trends in the past and what the future might hold for them.
Any other questions here in the room? Anything else? Well, that was fascinating. I think everybody's going, yeah. We really, really appreciate your coming again. And we hope that one day your travels will bring you to Texas, to Big Bend,
Yeah.
and to see if there's any condors that live down there in the Big Bend area. When you come, some of us are going to track you down.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I hope someday there are condors in Texas introduced there. I just published that paper on them and the sites at Big Bend that have those fossil remains. So I'm recommending that they introduce them there, and hopefully they will.
Appreciate your coming via Zoom, and if we get up to your area, we will certainly be happy to treat you to a nice supper.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, and safe travels in the Antarctic in January and February.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Good night.
Bye.